Hello everybody and welcome. This is a seed-saving resource. It was originally developed for a workshop we did with seed libraries, but there's lots of good information. I don't get into too many specifics about varieties, but it'll give you sort of an overall of why and how to save seeds. To start, I would just like to acknowledge that we are zooming in from all parts of what some people now refer to as British Columbia, but we're on unceded territory. And in working with seeds, I like to remind us that seeds, like land, were never given up. They were not ceded. They belong to the indigenous communities who stewarded them for thousands of years before they came to us. And seeds and humans have had a long multi-generational relationship. We support them and they feed us into the future, and many indigenous cultures saw them more as ancestors than in the way we see them in our capitalist system as a commodity to be sometimes hoarded and sold. So please remember, we care for the seeds because they've been supporting us for generations. Who we are is British Columbia is one of the oldest and largest food agriculture charitable organizations established in 1993. We are FarmFolk CityFolk. Our overarching mission is to connect and empower and inspire people to strengthen British Columbia's sustainable food system. And a food system without a good seed system is not very sustainable. So our programs celebrate local food. They connect people with farmers who grow it, and they support the local food movement, which we believe will help mitigate climate change and protect biodiversity. Through the BC Seed Security Program, we focus very specifically on our seed system, trying to develop and create and support a really resilient seed supply. So I'm going to get into a little bit about the basics of the importance of saving seeds. So seeds have been saved for a long, long time, ever since agriculture started about 12,000 years ago. It's only been in the last couple hundred years that every gardener and every farmer and people who grew food stopped actually saving their own seed. So seeds became a bit more specialized and they were produced by seed companies, and so gardeners and farmers started relying on these seed companies to produce seeds for them. Today we've seen an increase, unfortunately, in patents and barriers to seed saving, and this has led to more commercialization and the consolidation and ultimately control over a lot of the seeds that are out there. For example, the top 10 seed and chemical companies control over 65% of the global seed market. So there's this image that we often refer to that shows sort of the diminishing amounts of varieties that have been available over the last 100 and 150 years. And often I want to point out that although this is true, there have been varieties disappearing, the overall loss might not be as drastic as this image points out. And that's mostly because people like you have some of these varieties in your backyards. They probably haven't even made it onto this chart. Lots of people have seeds that were brought over by their ancestors or have been grown for years and years by their family. So working with all of our networks and the local seed libraries and different seed groups is a great way to increase the volumes of these more rare varieties and contribute to a greater genetic diversity of the varieties that we eat. There's also this image that shows the control of seeds and the amalgamation of seed ownership around the world. And again, I'd like to point out this this graphic, by the way, is a little bit old, so it is now outdated since this has been produced. Bayer has purchased Monsanto, and so if anything, it's moving. The graphic is moving into more consolidation and not less. But again, I'd like to point out a lot of these varieties. These are commodity varieties. There are a lot of genetically modified corn and soy varieties. Lots of hybrid varieties. They probably don't include a lot of the rare varieties that, again, we have in our backyards. And if we're growing them in our backyards and we have them in our seed libraries, then ultimately we have control over them. They are in the public domain still. Just to mention some of the benefits of seed saving. So why would you want to save seeds? For starters, you don't need to buy them. And this means that you're not reliant on seeds being shipped from further away, which we saw during the pandemic years. This was an issue for some people. You're going to contribute to increased seed security by, again, growing out these varieties that we have in the public domain. You're mitigating that loss within sort of the world of seeds. And as well, you get to choose what you're saving seeds for. So you save seeds for your own personal preference. Nobody out in the world is breeding seeds that you want specifically. You might find some that you like, but there's none that you specifically want. So, for example, a lot of tomato breeding is being bred for greenhouse production, large shipping distances, storability. They're not being bred for flavor and nutritional content, and these are things you can choose yourself when you save your own seeds. As well, when you save seeds in your own garden, you're actually optimizing those seeds to your local environment. So as seeds are saved and collected from one location, they over time will adapt to that one location. So in theory, the seeds you save over years will do better in your garden than the seeds that are purchased from further away. And then one of the last reasons, and one of my favorite reasons for growing seeds, is you don't just increase the genetic wealth of seeds out there, but you actually contribute to increase in all kinds of biodiversity by letting your plants flower. So often when you grow vegetables, you're harvesting them before the flowering stage. If you have a row of carrots going to flower or a row of broccoli going to flower, the amount of beneficial insects, the amount of pollen and nectar that you're providing for our insect ancestors and friends are, it really contributes positively to your garden ecosystem. So I'm going to talk a little bit, since we're here for a seed library conference, I'm going to talk a little bit about seed stewardship and the role of a seed library in that process. So there's different types of conservation of seeds. There's in situ conservation and ex situ. In situ literally means the plants are growing in the ground. So an old growth forest, for example, is a really good example of in situ conservation of some of those trees and plants that grow in the forest. We have often there's orchards that we have that maintain fruit varieties. These are plants being grown. Ex situ, as soon as you take those seeds off of those plants and you put them in an envelope and you store them somewhere, this is ex situ storage and conservation. And there's different versions of that as well. Many of you have probably heard of the Svalbard seed bank in Norway. This is long-term ex situ storage, and this means that you can put seeds in the vault. They should last for 50 years or more, and then when you bring them out, you can grow them again. However, those seeds haven't evolved with the change in climate over that time. So seed libraries really they're both in situ and ex situ seed conservation, and I think their goal and the objective is to move between those two as quickly as possible. So you don't want your seeds sitting in your seed library for a long time. You actually want to develop a system where you're constantly having your seeds grown out and the seeds in the library are fresh and new. The ultimate goal of a seed library, and this is a fairly sort of grand goal, but the goal of a seed library is to protect genetic diversity in our food systems and promote public access to seeds. Initially, seeds are donated or collected at each library, and then the community members can check out seeds and grow them on the condition that a portion of the freshly grown seeds will be donated back to the library. These seeds are then stored and made available to others who continue to contribute to the cycle of taking seeds, growing them, and donating a portion back to keep the collection viable, healthy, and fresh. Of course, in an ideal world, all books are returned to the library, and when seeds are taken out, all seeds are returned to a library. Seeds, unlike books, you don't plant your book in the ground, and there's not a chance of it rotting or having a crop failure with your book. It's fairly easy to make sure you can bring your book back to the library. Seeds, of course, we understand this is not always the case, and even the best gardeners out there are going to have a bad year or a bad crop. So of course you don't have to, you're not obligated to bring them back, but that is the eventual goal. And that's the goal of the seed libraries, and if we do it well, we'll really contribute to a robust sort of public supply of seeds. I'd like to just finish by mentioning that part of that big goal of seed libraries is actually seed stewardship. It's about stewarding those varieties. And stewarding seeds is different from saving them. It's the process of saving seeds with the purpose of maintaining the seed's health and resilience. It also includes the act of saving and selecting a variety over many years, over a long period of time, with the goal of passing it on to others in the future, and ideally passing it off in better shape than when we first got the seeds. So in order to be able to do that and steward our seeds well into the future, we need to have some plant knowledge. So I'm going to go over just the basic sort of plant structures and functions and some vocabulary around that. So the first thing we often need to learn are the different plant species. Plants, anything in a seed catalog, often you'll see the Latin name listed as the genus and species. The reason this is important is anything that is in the same species will cross with one another. The pollen can freely move between those different plants in the same species, and sometimes plant species, different plants are actually part of the same species. So as an example, the Brassica oleracea family includes a lot of our favorite vegetables. It was domesticated many, many years ago from a wild Brassica mustard plant. And this species includes Brussels sprouts and cabbage, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, and kohlrabi. So any of those flowering together in the field will freely cross. So if you're hoping to save cabbage seed and you have it flowering at the same time as kale seed, you need to know that the seeds saved are not going to actually produce what you're hoping. So the other thing to talk about is a cultivar. So what's a cultivar? A cultivar is just basically a cultivated variety. It's a group of genetically similar plants that have unique characteristics. So you may have two different cultivars, they're the same species, and they look quite different. So many of these cultivars, they actually rely on human domestication and the continued selection in order to exist. So a red radicchio variety, for example, if let to flower with other varieties over time, it will change. And in order to continue to be able to grow a nice round heading red radicchio, we need to steward that seed year after year by selecting those characteristics. The other kind of cultivar, so some of the types of cultivar, there's heirlooms is one that we hear about a lot. This just refers to an open pollinated cultivar that has been cultivated for a long time and selected, I believe, about 50 years or more. And if it's been around for more than 50 years, we call it an heirloom. It's really just an open pollinated variety. They generally have very good flavor and nutritional values. Remember, these were selected before we had long shipping distances for our food. They're not very popular in stores because of this, because they aren't necessarily selected for good shipability. But hopefully you don't need to ship them for much further from your garden to your kitchen. So that heirlooms are an open pollinated cultivar, but there's also other open pollinated cultivars that are newer versions. So we often talk about the role of us, the more modern seed breeders, we're hoping to create heirlooms of the future. So we don't have to hang on to only maintaining the heirlooms we've had in the past. We can create new open pollinated varieties, and 50 years from now, those will be our new heirlooms. So an open pollinated plant describes a plant that has grown through the uninhibited transfer of pollen between different members in the field. So if you plant out a species and you let it all flower freely, the pollen crosses freely, and this produces an open pollinated seed. The other kind of cultivar I'd like to just mention, and it's one that we often don't work with in seed libraries, is hybrids. So hybrid production started about 150, 200 years ago and has become very popular. It's extremely beneficial for large-scale industrial agriculture because hybrid varieties are typically robust and vigorous, but also very uniform. So if you want your entire field of broccoli to head up at the exact same time, a hybrid broccoli is great for that. Personally, in my garden, I'd like my broccoli to ripen over a long period of time because I don't want to have to harvest it all at once. So in order to produce a hybrid variety, you need to create two inbred parents. And inbred sounds just as it is. They're very uniform in their genetics, and they're not very adaptable and resilient. So one parent might have terrible flavor but excellent disease resistance, and the other parent might have excellent flavor but horrible disease resistance. And when you cross these two varieties together, the offspring of them, the seeds from those, produce a very vigorous plant that has both of those qualities. In order to produce this, you have to produce tons of parent lines, cross them together, and see what you get. And when you get a cross that works, then you can release your new hybrid variety. You maintain the parents yourself. When I say you, I mean a company that has put all the work into developing these varieties, and you don't share those parents with anybody. So really you would be the only one who is capable of producing those seeds. The challenge with a hybrid variety, and this is depicted in seed catalogs, you often see F1 beside the variety. This stands for filial generation 1, so it's the seeds produced after that initial cross of the inbred parents. If you save seeds from that F1 population and then you plant it out, you produce the F2 population. And this doesn't produce seeds that look like your F1. It produces plants that look like either parent 1 or parent 2 or somewhere in between. And so you're unable to actually reproduce the plant that you saved the seeds from. That plant is going to look quite different. It is possible to save seeds from a hybrid variety. It takes quite a long time because you're going to get that diversity in the F2 generation. If you continue year after year and select just as you would an open pollinated variety for the characteristics that you want to be selecting for from that hybrid, you will eventually produce an open pollinated new variety that is not a hybrid, but it is a long time commitment. I encourage people to actually go out and look at flowers. Just whenever you can, observe flowers. Try to identify the pollen shedding parts of the flower and the pollen receiving parts of the flower. The flower type tells you a lot about how a plant's reproductive cycle works. So it's really important. Pollination and reproduction are very tied together. Some plants are self-pollinated, which means that they, for the most part, pollinate themselves. As soon as the flower opens, they do pollinate the seeds, which means they're perfect flowers. They have both pollen receiving and pollen shedding parts of the flower, and they do the whole process without any help. Often there's plants that require cross-pollination. These are sometimes pollinated by wind and often by insects. The plants might be perfect. They might have both parts on the same flower, but there's some mechanism within the structure of that plant to inhibit self-pollination, whether it's timing of the different parts or flower design. So there's also so I've mentioned some flowers are perfect flowers and some flowers are imperfect flowers, meaning they don't have both the pollen receiving and pollen shedding parts. So monoecious plants, monoecious means one house, which means that both the pollen receiving and pollen shedding parts exist within one flower or on one plant. So a squash plant, for example, is a monoecious plant. It has both those types of flowers on the same plant, but they're separated into different flowers. So one of the flowers produces pollen and will never have a fruit on it, and the other flower is the part that receives the pollen and actually makes the fruit. So that would be considered an imperfect flower. Corn is an example of a monoecious plant with imperfect flowers as well. Tomatoes have perfect flowers and largely self-pollinating, as are beans and peas. And then dioecious plants, of which there's not many in our garden varieties, spinach being one, asparagus is another, cannabis is another one. The pollen producing and pollen receiving organs are actually on separate plants altogether. So if you plant out 100 spinach plants, half of those are going to shed pollen and not make seeds, and the other half are going to receive the pollen and produce the seeds. It's important to know so that you don't go and try to look for the seeds on half of your spinach plants and wonder why they're not there. And then it's important to understand the life cycle of plants as well. So those are often separated into annuals, biennials, and perennials. An annual is a plant that you will plant at the beginning of a growing season, and you will be able to harvest seeds by the end of the growing season. So tomatoes, beans, peas, a lot of the quick growing salad crops, lettuce. Biennials have a different type of life cycle. They need to go through a period of stratification, or often a cold period, in order to trigger them into switching their life phase from growing to seed production or to flowering. So a lot of us have never seen a flower of a carrot because we harvest our carrots in the first year that they're grown. And if you're lucky enough to have a flower from a carrot happen in the first year, don't think you're so lucky that you're going to be producing seeds. Those aren't desirable seeds, and that's not a desirable trait, because a carrot that has a flower on it is a very woody, tasteless carrot. So you want to select for these biennials to actually be biennials and not annuals. So it means you need to plant them one season, often dig them out of the garden, store them over winter, and then replant them in order to produce flowers. So this goes for carrots and beets and certain types of turnips and even some kinds of radishes. And then perennial plants, of course, are plants that grow year after year. Some have a long life cycle, some are short. Some produce seeds annually. Some take a few years to start producing seeds, and some produce seeds on certain cycles, like bamboo is something like a 7-year cycle that it produces seeds in. So now that you know some of that information, where do you start when you want to go and prepare your garden for seed production? So when you think about garden and garden design, you need to think about it in the context of your seeds and pollen flow. So you need to pay attention and think about things like the variety and the type of characteristics in the crop that you choose. So you maybe don't go to the grocery store and just grab a tomato out of a tomato. You don't know what that plant looked like. Think about the parents that you start with. You have this great ability to produce something that you really like. Start with varieties that you actually really like. It's important to think about location in the garden. So do you want to grow 2 different types of tomato seed in 1 year? If so, you need to isolate them by a certain distance. Tomatoes, they can be quite close together. Even 10 feet is enough isolation in most cases. Some crops you're just not going to be able to isolate in your garden without using some added technique, either a barrier of some sort or hand pollination. So if you grow a zucchini and a pumpkin, for example, in the same garden, those two are both in the species Pepo, and they'll both cross. And so you'll get a zuumpkin or a pupkini or something like that. And if you don't want that, you need to either hand pollinate or grow just one of those per year for seed. Another way to isolate, of course, is by timing. So you can't grow 2 corn plants in the same field if they're in 2 different cultivars and they flower at the same time. But the flowering times of corn differs fairly greatly depending on the varieties. So you may very well be able to grow one early flowering variety and one late flowering variety. As long as you plant them at the same time and the flowering doesn't overlap, you can actually collect seed from two species in the same season. You have to think about how much space you need in your garden, because population size varies depending on the species and the type of plant you're saving from. So if you're saving seeds from beans, peas, tomatoes, lettuce, you don't actually need a huge population size. Probably 5 to 10 individual plants is enough to maintain genetic diversity. But if you do this with carrots, for example, or corn, for too many generations in a row, it will affect the vigor of that seed into the future. So you just have to learn this depending on what variety you're working with. There's lots of resources online to find out whether they do need what the population size is, and I'll share that with you at the end of the presentation. And then you also need to think of timing in your garden. So the timing for harvest for market or for eating is sometimes very different than the timing for your harvest for seed maturity. So for example, cucumbers, if you plant them in a greenhouse and you're hoping to get them out by the end of the season in time to put say an overwintering salad crop in, you might be disappointed because those cucumbers have to really mature up in order to produce seed. You're not eating them at the same stage as you would a regular eating cucumber. And then we have to think about, so after you've saved your seed, you need to think about, this is moving into the seed preservation stage or the storage stage. You need to think about when to harvest, how to harvest, and then cleaning and storage. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So again, as I mentioned, seed harvest for seed is different sometimes than harvest for eating. So cucumbers are an example of this. Sometimes that's not the case. Tomatoes, for example, you can harvest tomatoes, you can scoop out the seeds, save the seeds, and eat the rest of the tomato, and this goes for winter squash as well. Something like zucchini, of course, you need to let that zucchini get much too big to the point where it's relatively inedible before you save seeds from it. So the seeds have to be like really mature, ideally on the plant or in the plant by the time you harvest it. And you have to think about what the plant does around seed maturity. So there's a lot of plants that actually drop their seeds or shed their seeds, and we have to know that that's going to happen so that we can gather the seeds before then. There's some plants that will dry on the plant and stay on the plant, but if they get wet, those seeds will all sprout and your whole crop is ruined. So you often will have to pull those seeds in at the end of the season before the rain hits them. Sometimes you might need to do this when the seeds are slightly immature and let them ripen up under cover somewhere. Plants with fleshy fruits, of course, you need to bring in. There's often a fermentation process that happens. You mush them up or scoop out the seeds and then clean and dry them very quickly afterwards. Yeah, and so there's different ways of cleaning seeds. So once you've cleaned seeds, say from cucumbers or tomatoes, sometimes those seeds have are good heavy seeds, and sometimes they're actually empty and light. So we can do a secondary cleaning by using wind to take out some of the lighter seeds, and this just increases the germination rate of the amount of seeds that we have left. Often when you're bringing seeds in from a crop where the seeds dry on the plant, you need to actually get the seeds out of the husk. In some varieties, this is very easy. A lot of the brassicas, you stomp on them and they come out no problem. On some of those plants, like radish, it requires a lot more threshing in order to remove the seeds from the husk. And then in the end, what you end up with is a container full of both seeds and plant material that's dried. And you need to separate these two out in order to just save the seeds. So this process is often called winnowing. And the other way we can separate these things out is by using screens of different sizes. There's lots of sizes of very specific seed screens made specifically for seed saving. But if you go to a thrift store and you find yourself a wide variety of sieves or strainers. You can do a lot of cleaning, seed screening with those. It's also very important, once you've cleaned your seeds, to let them dry. And when you think they're dry, dry them more. That's usually what I tell people. Don't put them into any sort of plastic bag if you're not 100% sure they're dry. They want to be dried usually down to like 8 to 10% moisture. Ideally put them in, just in case, I always put them in a paper container rather than a plastic container, because it can help with some, get rid of some extra moisture. And I would recommend against drying seeds in a dehumidifier, in a dryer, like a food dehydrator, because the temperature is often too hot. So you want them to dry down somewhere over a period of time. And on the west coast here, I'll mention, often outside in a garage is actually too damp to let your seeds fully dry. So if you have them out in a greenhouse, it might feel dry, but if you can't pick up plant matter and crumple it into like a very dry sort of, if it's not crumpling dry, if it has any moisture in it, then the seeds probably aren't that dry either. So I would recommend bringing them inside and letting them finish drying, or if you have a room with a dehumidifier in. In order to store your seeds, we mostly just want to store seeds in a consistent setting. So we don't, you don't have to have a temperature controlled room in order to store your seeds, but you don't want a lot of fluctuations in temperature. So find a spot in your house that sort of maintains a regular temperature. So up in the attic obviously isn't the best place. It's going to be hot in the summer and cold in the winter. Often a basement or under your bed is the best place to save them. And again, the goal is always to get them grown out on a regular basis, so we're not needing to do really long-term storage of our seeds at home. If you do want to save a small amount of seeds for a longer period of time, you can put them in a freezer, and that will definitely keep them for longer, as long as the freezer stays plugged in, and that's really important. And I'll just leave you with, there's lots of resources out there. Definitely the internet is a wealth of knowledge. There's so many resources. These are a few of our favorites. And as you dig into the specific seeds that you want to save, I just encourage you to go and research those seeds. This is one of the best resources around for the specifics on different varieties. It's a Seed Savers Exchange Seed Saving Guide. It lists the variety. It lists whether it's open pollinator or outcrossing. It gives you an idea of what population size you need and isolation distance. So I just encourage everybody to go out and save as many seeds as you can. Don't be discouraged if you have crop failures. We all do every year. Just keep doing it. And thank you very much for contributing to British Columbia and the world's genetics and plant species.